Imagine you are one of the most powerful men in a vast and terrifying empire. Your boss, the absolute dictator who holds the unquestioned power of life and death over you, over your family, and over millions of your fellow citizens, has just collapsed on the floor of his country home. He is lying in a puddle of his own urine, unconscious. And your first thought is not to call a doctor. Your first thought is, what does this mean for me? Am I safe? And what do I do next? The death of Joseph Stalin in March of 1953 was not just the end of a single brutal man, it was the sudden decapitation of a system that revolved entirely around his paranoid will. The moments and days that followed were a chaotic, terrifying, and darkly comical power struggle among his top lieutenants. This is not just a history lesson, it is a gripping, real-life thriller. It is a profound philosophical inquiry into the absurd nature of tyranny and a case study in what happens when the source of all fear is suddenly removed, leaving only the fearful to fight over the scraps. This is the story of the Game of Thrones that erupted in the Kremlin in the moments after a monster's death. The long vigil, the tyrant is dead. To understand the absurdity of what happened, you have to understand the atmosphere of absolute terror that Stalin had cultivated for decades. He was the sun, and his inner circle, the members of the Politburo, were like planets, held in a tight, fearful orbit by the sheer force of his gravity. He trusted no one. He would routinely have his closest friends and colleagues arrested, tortured, and executed. These men, his top deputies, lived in a state of constant, gnawing fear. Their survival depended on their ability to anticipate his moods, to laugh at his jokes, and to never, ever appear smarter or more powerful than he was. On the night of February 28, 1953, at his dacha or country home outside Moscow, Stalin hosted one of his usual, long, drunken dinners with the four most powerful men in his inner circle. Georgy Malenkov, his official deputy, Lavrentiy Beria, the terrifying head of the secret police, Nikolai Bulganin, and Nikita Khrushchev, the seemingly simple party boss from Ukraine. After the dinner, Stalin went to bed. The next day, the guards at the dacha became terrified. Hours went by with no sound from Stalin's room, but they were under strict orders never to disturb him. Their fear of Stalin alive was greater than their concern that he might be dead. For 12 agonizing hours no one dared to open the door. Finally, late that night a guard found the courage to enter. He found Stalin on the floor, soaked in urine, conscious but unable to speak. He had suffered a massive stroke. This is where the dark comedy begins. The inner circle was summoned. They arrived to find the dictator incapacitated. But what did they do? Did they immediately call for the best doctors in the country? No, they were too afraid. Stalin despised doctors. He was in the middle of a paranoid purge of Jewish physicians called the doctor's plot. Calling a doctor without his permission was a potentially fatal mistake. So, for hours, these powerful men just stood there, watching him, poking him, trying to figure out what to do. Beria at one point started celebrating only to cower in fear when Stalin seemed to show a sign of consciousness. It was a scene of utter paralysis, a group of men so conditioned by fear that they were unable to act, even to save the man who held all the power. The players in a deadly game. When it finally became clear that Stalin was not going to recover, the long vigil for his death became the opening scene of a ruthless power struggle. The old king was dying, and the four men who had been his closest courtiers were now the chief rivals for the throne. The most feared, and the most immediate contender for power, was Lavrentiy Beria. Beria was the head of Stalin's vast and terrifying security apparatus, the NKVD, the forerunner to the KGB. He was the man who had overseen the purges, the gulags, and the state-sponsored terror for years. He was brilliant, he was ruthless, and he was a sexual predator of monstrous proportions. Most importantly, he had compromising material, secret files, on every other man in the inner circle. He knew all their secrets, all their crimes, all their weaknesses, and everyone knew it. In the first hours after Stalin's stroke, Beria was the man who seemed to hold all the cards. He moved quickly to seize control, his men securing Moscow and the Kremlin. The official heir apparent was Georgy Malenkov. He was Stalin's deputy, a skilled bureaucrat, but he was seen by the others as weak, indecisive, and lacking a strong power base of his own. He was the man who was publicly designated as the new premier, the new head of government, but behind the scenes he was already being outmaneuvered. And then there was Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the party boss of the Moscow region, a man who had cultivated an image of being a simple, crude, and somewhat oafish Ukrainian peasant. The other, more sophisticated members of the inner circle often looked down on him. They saw him as a buffoon, but this was a profound miscalculation. Beneath the folksy exterior was a mind that was incredibly shrewd, politically cunning, and utterly ruthless. His greatest weapon was the fact that his rivals constantly underestimated him. These men were not friends. They were rivals who had survived for decades by a complex dance of flattery, backstabbing, and codependent fear. They were all complicit in the crimes of Stalin's regime, and now, with the source of their power and their fear dying on a couch in front of them, they had to figure out how to survive each other. The first days of freedom, a scramble for control. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin was officially declared dead. The news was broadcast to a shocked and grieving Soviet Union, but behind the scenes the scramble for power was already in full swing. The first public move was to declare a collective leadership. The surviving members of the Presidium, as the Politburo was now called, presented a united front to the world. They assured the country that there would be no new single dictator, that they would rule together as a team of equals. This was, of course, a complete and total lie. It was a temporary truce, a public performance designed to maintain stability, while the real battle was being fought in the secret corridors of the Kremlin. The first and most aggressive player was Lavrentiy Beria. In the days immediately following Stalin's death, Beria, to everyone's surprise, initiated a wave of shockingly liberal reforms. He declared a massive amnesty, releasing over 1 million prisoners from the Gulag camps. He officially condemned the doctor's plot as a fabrication, and had the accused physicians released. He even began to push for a more liberal policy in East Germany. What was he doing? Was this feared monster suddenly a secret liberal? Of course not. It was a brilliant and cynical power play. Beria knew that his power was based on the machinery of terror, but he also knew that the rest of the country, and even many in the party, were sick of the terror. By positioning himself as the great reformer, the man who was ending the worst excesses of Stalinism, he was trying to build a new popular power base for himself. He was trying to get ahead of the inevitable process of de-Stalinization and make it his own. His rivals were terrified. They saw Beria, the man who controlled the secret police and the files on all of them, now also trying to seize the popular mantle of reform. They realized that if he succeeded, he would become a new and perhaps even more powerful dictator than Stalin himself. The conspiracy, the wolves turn on the wolf. This is where the quiet, underestimated Nikita Khrushchev makes his move. Khrushchev understood the deadly logic of the situation better than anyone. He realized that the power struggle was not just about who would end up on top. It was, first and foremost, a matter of survival. And as long as Lavrentiy Beria was in the game, none of them were safe. Beria knew all their secrets. He had been the enforcer of their collective crimes. He could destroy any one of them at any moment. Khrushchev realized that the collective leadership had a single, urgent, and unstated task. They had to get rid of Beria. So, Khrushchev began to do what he did best. He began to conspire. In the months following Stalin's death, he started to have quiet, secret conversations with the other members of the Presidium. He played on their deepest fears. He reminded them of Beria's cruelty, of his ambition, of the secret files he held on all of them. He slowly and methodically built a coalition of the fearful. This was an incredibly dangerous game. These were men who had spent their entire adult lives in a state of deep and justified paranoia. They trusted no one. And now, Khrushchev was asking them to join a conspiracy, a secret plot where a single leak, a single betrayal, would mean their own immediate arrest and execution. He managed to win over key figures like Malenkov, the nominal head of state, and, crucially, he secured the support of the military, particularly the hugely popular war hero, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The military was one of the few institutions that had the power to stand up to Beria's secret police. With the army on his side, Khrushchev was finally ready to spring the trap. The coup and the new king. The final act of this dark drama took place in June of 1953, just 3 months after Stalin's death. Khrushchev called a meeting of the Presidium. He orchestrated the agenda so that Beria would be put on the defensive. One by one, the other members of the Presidium, who had all been secretly prepped by Khrushchev, began to stand up and denounce Beria, accusing him of being a British spy, of sabotaging the state, of moral degeneracy. Beria was stunned. He had completely underestimated the quiet cunning of Khrushchev and the deep fear he inspired in his colleagues. In the middle of the meeting, on a prearranged signal from Khrushchev, Marshal Zhukov and a group of armed military officers burst into the room and arrested Lavrentiy Beria, the most feared man in the Soviet Union. He was taken to a secret military bunker, put on trial in secret for treason and a host of other crimes, and a few months later, he was executed by a single gunshot to the forehead. The downfall of Beria was the decisive moment in the post-Stalin power struggle. It was a brutal and illegal act, a palace coup. But it was also a necessary one for the survival of the other leaders. With their greatest threat eliminated, the path was now clear for a new leader to emerge, and the man who had so skillfully orchestrated the entire conspiracy, the man everyone had underestimated, Nikita Khrushchev, would, over the next few years, consolidate his power and become the new, undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. The ultimate message of the story of Stalin's death is a profound philosophical lesson in the nature of tyranny. It reveals that a system built on total personal power and absolute fear is inherently and catastrophically unstable. When the tyrant is gone, the system has no logic, no rules, and no legitimacy. The only thing left is a primal Darwinian struggle for survival among the sycophants and killers who are left behind. It is a powerful and timeless argument for the importance of institutions, of the rule of law, and of systems of power that are not dependent on the life or death of a single fallible human being. It's a deep inquiry into the absurd and terrifying endgame of all dictatorships. If you believe that we must understand the pathologies of power to protect ourselves from them, then you are in the right place. Welcome to Geeky Philosopher. Subscribe, and let's continue to explore the vital philosophical lessons of history.